Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the YouthLead webinar series. I'm Maria Brindelmeyer, the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist and YouthLead Coordinator with the Youth Power Learning Project at Making Sense International. Before we get started with our speakers for today, a few housekeeping instructions. Please help share the information more widely on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and you can see our hashtags and handles above. The slides and the recording will be shared on youthlead.org after the webinar. On today's webinar and other webinars, you'll get to know our team members. I'm the one on the left, and you can see Abolaji Omitogon and Ikenna Anyadise, two Atlas Corps fellows from Nigeria who focus on knowledge management and communications for both YouthLead.org and YouthPower.org, including content maintenance and webinars. Nilima Raut, the second from the left, is the project manager for YouthLead and also an Atlas Corps fellow from Nepal. YouthLead is a component of the Youth Power Learning project, and Youth Power Learning is focused on sharing knowledge, learning, tools, and best practices, and what works in positive youth development with the broader development community and with youth. We have defined positive youth development as containing 4 components. Youth should have assets, that could be skills or funding, should have the ability to leverage those assets, that means agency, and the ability to contribute to positive change for themselves and their communities. And youth should also be surrounded by an enabling environment that supports them. Until last year, Youth Power Learning's main focus was on youth supporting organizations, for example, organizations that were implementing youth programs or doing research about youth programs. But the focus had not been on youth themselves as a target audience for the website. With YouthLead, which was launched at the World Bank's Youth Summit in December 2018, the focus is on young change makers 15 to 35 years old. So let me hand it over to Nilima. Nilima, tell us a little bit more about YouthLead.
Thank you, Maria. The vision for YouthLead is to become the global hub for young change makers aged 15 to 35, enabling them to maximize their impact through networking, mentoring, and accessing information. The platform offers a great opportunity for youth, different countries, different networks, to inspire and learn from each other, connect beyond their traditional circles, and benefit from many diverse resources and information. And with Google Translate on every page, it is available to a larger group of youth. We have selected over 20 young change makers as YouthLead ambassadors. The ambassadors are sharing information about YouthLead with their networks and increasing engagement with YouthLead through discussion groups, social media, and now also by sharing their experiences through webinars. In addition to selecting the YouthLead ambassadors, we are also organizing campaigns. For example, a photo contest and a video contest. We are organizing campaigns, mini campaigns by topic, example on mental health or peace building with relevant resources. And we are organizing webinars, some led by ambassadors, some by YouthLead sponsors. We have over 20 sponsors that are collaborating on YouthLead. Now, let me hand it over to today's host of the webinar.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning again. Today's topic is titled Leading Societal Change Through Policy, Service, and Action. We're excited to have one of our YouthLead ambassadors as speaker, in the person of Shakira Korana, who is the African Union Youth Council policy advisor and South African representative, of course, from South Africa. Shakira will share what she's doing in the areas of policy, service, and action, and of course, the importance of youth's involvement in the process that shapes our societies. We will not take questions until the end of Shakira's presentation, so please feel free to post your questions on the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Shakira, I'll be handing over now to you to please do your introduction to our audience and, of course, continue with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Abulaji. It's great to be on this YouthLead platform, hopefully, and I hope many young people are tuning in, but others as well who are interested in youth development and youth empowerment as well. So a very brief introduction into myself before we get really into the essence of today's webinar. To share a little bit of a background, I've recently been appointed to the African Union Youth Council. It's quite a historic role because the AU has never had a youth council before. For those of you unfamiliar with the African Union, it is a continental body for Africa, similar, for example, to the European Union. Within the AU, I serve as the policy advisor because of my research background, policy background as well, and also the Southern African representative. Very briefly, a little bit about myself. So I have work experience in advocacy specifically, which I enjoy in public health. I was previously based at the Global Health Advocacy Incubator, working on obesity policies, for example, the tax on Coca-Cola, so sugary beverage taxes. Very exciting, or a highlight within my career was really to be based at the SRHR Africa Trust, which was formerly known as the Southern African AIDS Trust. What was really a landmark in my career was to develop what's known as the Sat for Youth program. We had physical spaces in countries across Africa where youth would connect. We also had online engagements and also created an activism and leadership program known as Creating a Youth Quake in Sexual and Reproductive Health. As mentioned, I also have a background in health policy and systems research, sexual and reproductive health rights, specifically HIV prevention, which I'm very passionate about, disability, youth development, also linked to advocacy, and non-communicable diseases. For those of you not familiar with the health sector, non-communicable diseases refers to your cancers, your heart disease, etc. So I'm sure many of you have already started watching a number of webinars, specifically led by different ambassadors. I'm very excited to be an ambassador for South Africa and the Africa region as well. To tell you a little bit about YouthLead before we delve into the webinar, as I said, you can follow youthlead.org online. What do I like about YouthLead, and why do I think it's such a critical role or element or program in the development space? It really brings together a diverse and powerful network of youth activists and really change makers across various fields. So it's not just one field, but it brings us across various fields. There are also a large number of resources which youth can tap into. More recently, there was a webinar on mental health, and I then went onto the website or the platform and shared resources on mental health with various civil society organizations. So there's a very rich resource base. How can we actually leverage the platform? In healthcare, we would call something like YouthLead or a platform like YouthLead a community of practice. So it's really a community of practice which brings together very young experts, professionals, and practitioners. And if you go onto the platform, you'd get to see that you're able to connect with youth absolutely worldwide, and it's growing exponentially. As I mentioned, in a community of practice, what's really useful and great about YouthLead is we're able to share opportunities. I specifically like the funding opportunities, so do many members who've signed up as well. But there are also opportunities to create projects and get involved, leverage skills, and tap into a skill set of youth that you may not necessarily have the expertise in. How do I hope to contribute to YouthLead? We're ambassadors, obviously, for a period of time, but I think it's a platform which has great potential. It's already showing us great action, great resources, and to be able to continuously expand the network. I think what needs to emerge from YouthLead is really a movement building of sorts, an online movement building, starting to identify areas for collective action and collaboration, but also to continuously engage with the very vast network or array of members and change makers that the platform has. So I encourage you to go onto youthlead.org and follow us on social media as well. Moving on to the topic of the discussion today, as Abulaji introduced, and based on my role in the African Union, but also being an ambassador, I wanted to center this really on the journey of being in the AU, how I've come to learn the African Union, and something I committed to when I was appointed to the African Union to various young people was that I want to bring the AU as a continental body closer to young people. So this presentation is centered on the African Union as a continental body. It also gives insight into blogs, various divisions of the African Union. To tell you very briefly, as I mentioned before, the African Union is a continental level body. It consists of 55 member states. It stems from the Organization of African Unity, which was created in the mid-1950s, and more recently, the AU was founded on that in 2002. The African Union is really the beacon of hope for young people and the population on the continent. So it is an absolutely essential body. It's positioned to take the continent forward by developing essential policies and frameworks to guide our member states, so to guide our countries and to guide our regional bodies. So there are different areas of focus within the African Union. As I mentioned, if you're not familiar with a continental body, you could think of the European Union. The AU similarly focuses on health. It's got an economics division. It's got a peace and security division. It's got a division of social affairs, and given my background in health, I am linked to the division of social affairs. And it's also got a youth division, which I'm very excited to touch on during this webinar. The website, and you'll see a picture of the AU and what's trending. So 1 million by 2021, the AU reforms, Agenda 2063. It's all very, very useful, and you get all of this onto the website. So I would encourage you to log on there. The one sort of central point in bringing all the work on the continent together and the efforts on the continent together, but also bringing together the continental commitments and political will, is what's decided as the AU theme of the year at the beginning of the year on an annual basis in January. It's usually linked to the Heads of State Summit. And for example, previous themes included achieving the demographic dividend, so the power of young people and what it could contribute to society. Last year was a very essential theme. It was a theme of corruption. I think that is absolutely critical in our context. And this year, it really hits home because we're seeing the number of migrants, refugees, etc. on the continent. And the AU theme of the year this year is refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons. To get into the meat of the webinar, it's about, like I said, giving you a snapshot of policy commitments. So since I have been appointed, I have been reading through various policy documents, and I realized that youth do not go through a 100-page document, right? So how can I summarize it for young people, but not just a summary, identify areas for advocacy and action? Because what's important is that these commitments are made, our governments actually ratify or adopt these commitments, but accountability is very weak. And us as young people need to be familiar with the African Union and these policies. This is really, really just a snapshot, and there's a lot more content that you could visit. on YouthLead.org as well. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about Youth Alert, touch on the various divisions of the African Union, and then highlight specific areas of how you as young people can get involved in the African Union. I've also highlighted at the bottom of this slide and a few other slides worth following on Twitter, the different divisions of the African Union, which I think are critical for us to keep an eye on. As I already mentioned, so I won't go into too much detail. What I do is I go through, as a policy advisor, I go through the actual policy documents in line with the Instagram post, Best of 9 of 2019, for those of you who remember that. I try and draw out 9 points for a quick 5-minute read. Youth Alert is meant to equip you as young people to have the knowledge at your fingertips of what the policy commitments are, and more importantly, how do we push these documents from being, and if I may, dead and buried, from being empty promises to living commitments, and what we need to strive for and hold leaders accountable to. I think that the correct point to start for us within the AU as young people would be the youth division. And the youth division has multiple programs that I can't go through during the entire webinar, but this is just a little bit of an inkling of what the division does and what are some of its important projects. If you look on the right-hand side, I actually got to meet some of the YouthLead ambassadors from Chad and Ethiopia earlier this year in February. The youth division launched a flagship program known as the 1 million by 2021. I did say, and I do think it's quite a small target, but at least it's measurable. It was launched at the second Pan-African Youth Summit in February this year. The idea is that it's centered on reaching 1 million young people by 2020, which is the deadline, in the areas of what we call the 4 E's. So reaching 1 million people for entrepreneurship, employment, education, and very interestingly, youth engagement, something we haven't really seen in the development field before. What I do identify as an important area is that, as I mentioned, we have these policies, we have the programs, but we as youth need to play a role in monitoring the progress of reaching this 1 million target, but also advocating with our governments to actually reach the 1 million target as well. There's a link on this slide, which you can also access on YouthLead.org as a resource, an inspirational couch interview about the 1 million by 2021 project. If you follow it on Twitter, hashtag 1M by 2021, you will see it's the trending program for the youth division and the AU up until 2021. When I first started the African Union, I dug very deep into the documents to see what is our main policy commitment. And the main policy commitment is known as the Africa Youth Charter. Some of you may know it. I must admit, I did not know it. And it was a very enlightening document to read. So the African Youth Charter was adopted by heads of states in 2006. So we're sitting almost 13 years later. It came into effect since 2009. The way these policies work is that they're developed, our member states then ratify them. When a certain amount of states actually ratify them, it then comes into effect. There's a list of ratifications, but what you will see is that 90% of countries on the continent have ratified the Youth Charter. Again, what is a problem? We have this absolutely critical document, but we are not monitoring implementation or holding our governments to account. For example, in South Africa, the Youth Charter is rarely spoken about, but the South African government has actually ratified it. From the 9-point summary, and the one, I would say that the one area which stood out is that the Youth Charter points interestingly to youth responsibility, and that really touches on the YouthLead portal, bringing change makers together and activists together. And I feel that the youth responsibility element is really missing. On the one hand, we have youth engagement, and that is absolutely necessary. But once you're engaged as a young person, what is your responsibility? Other interesting facts from the summary of Youth Alert on the Youth Charter is to professionalize youth work, which I'm sure many of you listening in would agree with. Adopt a preferential recruitment policy for African youth with specialized skills. So, for example, making sure that those who have the skills have easy visa processes. Protected from economic exploitation. So I think the Youth Charter is very strong in dealing with the economic aspects of young people. Equal pay for equal work. From a gender element, securing the right for young women to maternity leave. I thought that was very interesting. And finally, developing measures to regulate the formal economy. So if you read through the Youth Charter, you will see some of these areas. And the informal economy is quite huge on the African continent, but this is ignored from our policies and broader development. There was something very interesting that we can hold our governments to account to is under Article 12 of the African Youth Charter is that all of these commitments need to have adequate and sustained budgetary allocation. This charter was adopted and ratified in 2009. The question is, in 2018, are we as young people monitoring this? And it's about time that we actually start to do so. I was quite inspired by the Youth Charter and joined a global team to write the first ever 2 pieces in global health in the Lancet. They're also listed as resources on YouthLead. The one is the urgency for transformation, youth engagement in global health. And the other one, as I mentioned, the African Youth Charter speaks to youth responsibility. And this really inspired the piece, at least from my side, of changing the narrative. So we as youth are not just waiting for development and waiting for engagement, but we have the responsibility to push that. And I think it's also at the core of the YouthLead program. So we talked a little bit about the African Union Youth Division. Moving on to the African Union Free Trade Agreement. Very broadly, it's actually one of the largest free trade agreements ever in the continent's history. It will be the largest in the world as well. And it's meant to really push a continental framework of transport, of free trade, of restrictions on export duties, etc. You will notice it's really trending on social media. And what's very important for us is to ensure that the youth narrative is pushed within this African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Moving on to the African Union efforts on corruption. If you go down to the bottom of the slide, you will see the AGA platform, AGA platform. Very critical to this is and the African Union heads of states and government adopted the AU Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption in Africa. The convention was entered into force on August the 5th, 2006. Similarly to the Youth Charter, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the Youth Alert tries to provide a summary of this as well. I also identified some points of advocacy. So while we're reading policy documents as young people, we need to see what are the gaps and what can we advocate on. So 15 states are yet to ratify this convention on corruption, and we know that corruption is quite rife on the continent. We need to keep an eye on the monitoring frameworks of these commitments. And very interestingly, it said that in most of West Africa, this has not been adopted as well. So for example, these are some of the areas we can advocate on. Last year, we noted that there were youth consultations held in Botswana, Senegal, and Morocco, and I've also provided a link for this. I hope you're starting to feel a lot closer and a lot more in tune to some of the efforts of the African Union. Finally, and this is quite exciting, I've now started to write Youth Alert in series, and this is linked to my expertise in health specifically. The African Union has the African Centers for Disease Control, Africa CDC, And as I mentioned, I'm currently writing a series on this. Africa CDC tackles major issues on the continent linked to disease outbreaks in public health. One example is Ebola. And there's an upcoming event, a roundtable to raise money for the Ebola crisis in the DRC and other areas on the continent. The Africa CDC is quite new. It was only formulated in 2015, but it is an absolutely essential body for dealing with outbreaks such as Ebola, but also keeping a surveillance of other diseases on the continent. Their Twitter handle, Africa CDC, is also listed. Other continental commitments, which you can read up more on both on YouthLead and also on the AU, include the Mapuche Protocol, for those of you involved in contraception, sexual and reproductive health, HIV. The Mapuche Protocol speaks to gender equality on the continent. It talked about the gender pay gap aeons ago, and it also talks for budgetary allocations similar to the Youth Charter for our countries. The Africa Health Strategy brings together the continental commitments on healthcare. Again, as young people, it is so critical for us to know that it's not just the Sustainable Development Goals, but within Africa, we have policy commitments such as the Mapuche Protocol, which fights for women and girls' rights as well. So I then went to identifying a few opportunities of how you can get involved. I'm sure many of you are interested in employment. And this is not, again, comprehensive, just provides a bit of a snapshot and an introduction. Employment at the African Union for Youth could be through the volunteer program. It's actually a very massive, exciting program which allows you to be based throughout the continent. And actually, it is a paid program, even though it's called Volunteer Corps. And although the application for this year is already closed, I would encourage you to keep an eye on this. For those of you who have different expertise and are professionals, you can also visit the General AU Career Vacancy website. So what are some of the lasting advice that I have for peers being within the African Union and given all that I've just told you? I think again, it goes back to youth responsibilities. We have an array of policies on the continent ratified by our countries, but we as young people need to familiarize ourselves with these policies. We need to check what our countries have and haven't ratified. Why haven't they ratified? We need to push for implementation, and most importantly, we need to monitor progress. Other opportunities, I think, is to collaborate with the African Union. If there are others in YouthLead, either members or funders, or even outside of the platform who we can refer to say, let's have a collaboration with the African Union. One great example that we have that many could get involved in is the AU-EU Youth Hub. And from what I understand, they run programs on entrepreneurship. Look and implement projects, make use of the hashtags, and check out the trends, specifically hashtag 1 million by 2021. The 1 million project is the main project of the youth division, which we need to keep a track of and get involved. Africa CDC, which is the public health unit of the African Union, but really deals with disease outbreaks, not all public health issues, as I mentioned, advertises great courses. They had a course on proposal writing, antimicrobial resistance. Also keep an eye out for the website, social media accounts. I have tried to load these opportunities on YouthLead as well. For example, we had a Born Salima competition to win $1,000 for designing a logo against female genital mutilation. And being on the YouthLead website and listing it as an opportunity really led to this led to us having a large number of applications, which was great. So I'll end up there. Some of the important links of the different strategies I've summarized to date. As I mentioned, there's a lot more. There's a whole body of resources to still get through and continue to go through. the current Youth Alert series, tied into my background in health and my ambassador role as well, is on Africa CDC. I'm particularly interested in the Ebola crisis, what's happening on the ground, and the youth voice in Ebola is really missing, but Africa CDC has been fantastic in bringing us from the African Union Council into discussions on how to engage young people more in the Ebola crisis. So we have time for questions and answers. As Abulaji mentioned, you could post them. I'd also encourage you to get in touch anytime. I've also put a link up to my Twitter account.
Thank you very much, Shakira.
And
this
my
is
website,
beautiful.
which
thank
has
you very,
all the
very much for
YouthLead
this
articles.
really interesting and insightful presentation about what you're working at the African Union and what the African Union is currently doing. I would like to ask a few questions. So we have a few questions that we gathered already. And before we, of course, switch to our audience online. Hello, Shakira, are you still there?
Yes, I can hear you, Abulaji.
Oh, okay, very good.
Abulaji.
So the first question, yes, is that what have you found to be the biggest challenges so far in your African Union activities?
So I'm going to speak very frankly because I think it's an important discussion to be had, especially since the youth division is talking towards youth engagement as well. On the one hand, I think we are a very historic structure because we're the first ever in the AU. But at the same time, because we're the first structure, it also means that everything's not very clear of what we're doing, how we're doing, and how we can contribute. So I found that a little bit difficult as a young person. But also being a researcher and more importantly, an activist or a person working in advocacy, now entering into a diplomatic role is slightly challenging for me as well.
Well, thank you very much, Shakira. So I would also ask a question, and the second question goes thus. What is the African Union?
I hope that answered my question, Abulaji.
Yes, it did. So the second question goes thus: what is the African Union doing in reaching youth in underserved areas of the African continent, most especially in ensuring its policies reflect gender balance, infrastructure development, education accessibility for marginalized communities, including people with disabilities?
I think it's a problem not just for the African Union, but I think for the broader development world as well. I do think the private sector, for example, has been able to reach people in remote areas very well. So if we think of different big giants, but also the banking sector, for example, in South Africa. If I think of the banking sector in South Africa and Kenya, which has reached marginalized populations in rural areas as well. I think it remains a massive challenge for the AU. The AU does have a firm commitment to gender representation. Most of the policies are gender responsive. Having read many of them as well, I would say that. But I would conclude saying it still remains a massive challenge of reaching youth in rural areas. What we do try to do sometimes, or when we have policy discussions, is try to bring youth who are either in conflict settings or in these rural areas, or those with disabilities to our settings, like the Pan-African Humanitarian and Youth Summit earlier this year. But overall, it is something we still need to crack the code on.
Thank you very much, Shakira. And lastly, the third question is, out of all the different issues that the African Union deals with, which of this is the one that you're most passionate about, and why?
The one I'm most passionate about is, I think it's a clear issue on the continent and we cannot run away from it, and that's corruption. And when I started the webinar, I said, last year the theme of the year was corruption, and I think that's possibly our largest issue that I'm passionate about and I think we need to solve. But it's really tough to choose between the issue of corruption and also the issue of young people. So I really am passionate about both issues, but I think that both, especially corruption, takes precedent, I guess.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge. Thank you also again. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us today on today's webinar. And if you have any question, please feel free to post the questions in the chat box, and our speakers will be attending to them. If you have not joined YouthLead, I encourage you all to do so, and this will enable you to network with other young change makers and also join the discussion groups on YouthLead. As a member, you can post your content, share resources, your short videos or blogs, or even events and other funding opportunities with other young change makers on YouthLead. You can also join our discussion groups and also post your projects and also get visibility for your project. Every month, members also get YouthLead newsletters, and where we highlight our young change makers on the platform. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, to continue to engage with us. And above all, please reach out to our sponsors and continue discussion with them about these topics, and also in the discussion groups. I would also use this opportunity to say thank you to our many sponsors. In addition to the funding, they contribute resources and also the youth network to the platform. And of course, you'll be hearing from YouthLead sponsors from time to time and on various webinars. Last but not least, again, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today. We hope you will join us our next webinar, and continue to check our event page on YouthLead for more webinar announcements, or even on Facebook for maybe webinar announcements. And as said in the beginning, so the presentation will be available on the YouthLead website. Thank you all to all the registrants again, and I hope to see you next time.